All right, welcome back everyone to Turkish Law Talks.
It's great to be back.
So, for those of you who've been following along with this series, you'll remember last time we were looking at the Charter of Alliance and the Edict of Tanzimat.
Yeah, two really key documents in Ottoman legal history.
Absolutely, and kind of setting the stage for what we're going to dive into today.
Yeah, building on that foundation.
Exactly. So we're moving forward in time, and today we're going to be talking about the Edict of Reform of 1856.
Also known as the Islahat Fermanı.
Right, Islahat Fermanı and the first Ottoman Constitution.
Yeah, the Kânûn-i Esâsî of 1876.
Okay, so two pretty substantial legal developments here.
Huge. Really trying to, bring the Ottoman legal system, more into line with kind of modern ideas.
Modernizing it.
Exactly.
So with the Islahat Fermanı, the Edict of Reform, what was the overarching goal? What were they trying to do here?
Well, I think the real core of this edict was to create a sense of true equality between Muslim and non-Muslim citizens in the empire.
Okay, equality before the law.
Yeah, that was really the driving force behind it. And to do that, they put in place a whole bunch of changes.
So let's break down some of those changes. What are some of the key provisions of the edict?
Well, the first one kind of carries on from what we were talking about last time with the Tanzimat reforms.
Right, that continuity.
Exactly, reaffirming the inviolability of life, property, honor, and dignity for everyone.
No matter their background.
Right, regardless of their religion or anything else.
So really building on that idea of security for all citizens?
Yeah, and specifically mentioning that non-Muslim communities could keep their spiritual privileges.
Okay, so it's not just physical safety, but also recognizing their distinct religious identities.
Exactly, exactly. And then point two, I think this one's particularly interesting. It focuses on freedom of religion, conscience, and worship for everybody.
Okay, so freedom of belief.
Yeah, meaning no one could be humiliated or discriminated against because of their religion.
Right, no forced conversions.
And most importantly, it abolished the death penalty for converting from Islam.
Wow, that's huge.
Yeah, a major step towards individual religious freedom.
Moving away from that very severe punishment. Okay, what about point three?
So this one starts to break down some of the barriers in terms of participation in public life.
Okay, so opening up opportunities.
Yeah, so it said that people could enter state service or get civil jobs regardless of their nationality or religion.
So that's a big step towards inclusion.
Yeah, and it also opened up all the schools, military and civilian, to everybody.
Even military service is open to everyone.
That's right, although they did include this interesting little clause that allowed people to pay a fee to be exempt.
Oh, so there's a loophole.
Well, you could see it that way. It kind of raises questions about who ends up serving.
Right, the implications of that choice.
Yeah, fascinating stuff.
So that's provision one. What about provision two? What does that cover?
Okay, so point four of this provision is a really big change for the legal system.
Okay, what is it?
It says that in court, the testimony of Muslims and non-Muslims would be considered equal.
Oh, so no more weighing one over the other.
Exactly. And it also says they're going to set up mixed courts to deal with disputes between people of different religions.
So a move towards a more unified legal system.
Yeah, and hopefully a fairer one, too.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yep.
Okay, what's next on the list?
So point five is about modernizing punishments.
Okay, how so?
Well, they planned to create new codified penal laws.
So writing it all down clearly.
Yeah, making it more systematic. And they also wanted to introduce public trials.
So justice could be seen to be done.
Precisely. And a big one here, they abolished torture.
That's certainly a step in the right direction.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And they also talked about making punishments more humane in general.
Okay, so really trying to reform the whole penal system.
Yeah. And the last point, point six, this one's about finances.
Okay, money matters.
They wanted to make taxation more equal.
That sounds fair.
And a big change, they planned to get rid of tax farming.
What's tax farming?
Well, basically, they used to auction off the right to collect taxes.
Oh, I can see how that could lead to problems.
Yeah, all sorts of issues with corruption and inequality.
So abolishing that system makes a lot of sense.
It was a big step towards fairness.
So it sounds like the Edict of Reform was a pretty ambitious attempt to create a more modern and equitable society.
Yeah, a lot packed into that one document.
Absolutely.
Right.
Okay, so now let's move on to the Kânûn-i Esâsî, the first Ottoman constitution.
This one's from 1876.
Right. And what kind of document was this? How should we understand it?
Well, it's described as a constitution in the form of an imperial decree, or arad-i-sine.
Okay, so does that mean it's not really a constitution?
Not exactly. It just means it was ultimately the Sultan's will that brought it into being.
Okay, so from the top down.
But in terms of structure and content, it really was a constitution. It had 119 articles divided into 19 sections.
Wow, so pretty substantial document.
Oh, yeah. And they took its status very seriously. Article 115 specifically states that no part of this basic law could be suspended or repealed for any reason.
So it was meant to be the foundational legal text.
Exactly. And to make sure it stayed that way, they made the process for amending it much more difficult than for ordinary laws.
Okay, so it's what they call a rigid constitution.
That's right.
So what about the content of the Constitution? What were some of the key things it addressed?
Well, a big part of it was dedicated to fundamental rights and freedoms.
Like what? Give me some examples.
Well, Articles 8 through 26 were all about what they called the public rights of Ottoman subjects.
Okay, what kind of rights are we talking about here?
Well, starting with the basics, they define citizenship in Article 8,
Okay, who's in, who's out?
and then things like personal liberty in Article 9,
Okay, freedom of movement.
personal security in Article 10,
So protection from harm.
freedom of worship in Article 11,
Right, religious freedom.
freedom of the press in Article 12, freedom to form companies in Article 13.
Wow, so a pretty wide range of freedoms there.
Yeah, and it goes on.
What else did they include?
Well, they had the right to petition the government in Article 14.
Okay, so you could take your grievances to the authorities?
Freedom of education in Article 15, and the very important principle of equality before the law in Article 17.
That's a cornerstone of any just system.
They also had the right to public employment in Article 19, the idea that taxes should be proportional to your wealth in Article 20.
So no unfair burden on anyone.
Protection of private property in Article 21, the inviolability of your home in Article 22.
So your home is your sanctuary.
The right to legal protection by the courts in Article 23.
Right, access to justice.
And they reiterated the prohibition of confiscation and forced labor in Article 24, making sure taxes were legally authorized in Article 25, and they specifically banned torture again in Article 26.
Okay, so they really seem to be emphasizing those fundamental rights and freedoms.
They did, and there's also Article 83, which is in the section on the judicial system, but it specifically guarantees the right to seek justice.
So they really wanted to make sure people had access to the courts.
Absolutely.
Okay, so that's the Bill of Rights, so to speak. What about the structure of the government? Did the Constitution create a legislative body?
It did. They established what they called the General Assembly, or Meclis-i Umumi.
And what was the structure of this General Assembly?
It was bicameral, meaning it had two chambers, the Chamber of Notables and the Chamber of Deputies.
Okay, two houses. So tell me about the Chamber of Notables. How is that set up?
Well, all the members and the president were appointed for life by the Sultan,
So not elected.
and their number couldn't be more than 1/3 of the Chamber of Deputies.
Okay, so a smaller appointed body.
That's right.
And what about the Chamber of Deputies? How are they chosen?
They were elected. They had one deputy for every 50,000 male Ottoman subjects.
Okay, so based on population.
And they served 4-year terms.
Okay, fixed terms.
It's interesting, though, because they were considered to represent the entire Ottoman state, not just their local area.
Oh, so a broader perspective.
Exactly.
So you've got these two chambers. How did they actually go about making laws?
Well, the right to propose laws was shared between the Council of Ministers, the Chamber of Notables, and the Chamber of Deputies.
So multiple entry points.
But the Council of Ministers had the broadest scope. They could propose laws about pretty much anything.
Okay, so they had a lot of power there.
Yeah, and for the two chambers, the proposals they made had to be approved by the Sultan first.
So he still had a pretty significant role.
Oh, yeah. If he approved, then the proposal would go to the Council of State.
What did the Council of State do?
They were the ones who actually wrote the text of the bill.
Okay, the drafting stage.
Yeah, and then that draft would be debated and voted on first by the Chamber of Deputies and then by the Chamber of Notables.
So both houses had to approve it.
And then, finally, it went back to the Sultan for his sanction, his official approval.
So he got the final say.
Absolutely. And he had absolute veto power. Article 54 is very clear. If he didn't approve, it didn't become law.
Wow, so even with this new legislature, the Sultan was still very much in control.
Oh, yeah, his authority was still paramount.
Okay, so that's the legislative branch. What about the executive branch? Who was in charge of actually running the government?
Well, the executive branch consisted of the Sultan and the Council of Ministers.
Okay, so a dual structure.
And just to remind you, Article 3 of the Constitution says that the Sultan's successor would be the eldest son.
Right, keeping it in the family.
And the Sultan had a lot of power. Article 7 lays out all his prerogatives.
Like what? What could he do?
Well, he could appoint and dismiss all the ministers.
Okay, so he controlled the cabinet?
He could confer titles and decorations, authorize the printing of money, enter into treaties, declare war and peace.
Wow, that's a lot of power.
He also commanded the armed forces, made sure the laws were enforced, including Sharia law.
So both secular and religious law enforcement.
He could reduce sentences, grant pardons, convene and dismiss the General Assembly, and even dissolve the Chamber of Deputies.
So he could get rid of the elected body if he wanted to.
And of course, as we already said, he could veto laws, and according to Article 113, he could exile people he considered a threat to the state.
Okay, so a lot of power concentrated in the Sultan. What about the Council of Ministers? What was their role?
Well, the Council of Ministers included the Grand Vizier, the Shaykhul-Islam, and the other ministers.
Okay, so the top officials.
And the Grand Vizier acted as the chairman.
Okay, so he was kind of like the prime minister.
Yeah, you could see it that way.
And were they accountable to the legislature in any way?
Not really. They were appointed and dismissed by the Sultan, and they answered only to him.
Okay, so no parliamentary oversight.
The Chamber of Deputies couldn't hold a vote of confidence or censure them or anything like that.
So it's not really a parliamentary system in the way we think of it today?
Exactly. It might look a bit like a parliamentary monarchy, but the Sultan's power was so much greater.
He was still the dominant figure.
Yeah, and that means the legislature couldn't really override his will. So it's not a full parliamentary democracy, not in this initial form.
Right, it's something else.
It's its own unique system.
So we've talked about the legislature and the executive. What about the judicial branch? How did the Constitution address the courts?
Well, they really wanted to make sure the judiciary was independent.
Okay, so separating powers.
And they had a few key principles to achieve that.
Like what?
Judges couldn't be removed from their posts without a good reason.
So job security for judges.
And all trials had to be public.
Transparency.
And everyone had the right to seek justice through the courts.
Okay, access to justice for all.
And the courts had a duty to actually hear and decide the cases.
So they couldn't just ignore them.
And people had the right to be judged by a properly appointed judge.
So no kangaroo courts.
And the law courts, the mahakim, were supposed to be independent.
Okay, so no interference for the other branches.
They also had different types of courts. They had the Sharia courts, which applied Islamic law.
Right, the religious courts.
And they had the civil courts, the Nizamiya, which dealt with criminal cases and disputes under the new laws.
So secular courts as well.
And they also set up a public prosecution system.
So people to actually bring charges.
And they created a high court, the Divan-e-Ali, to try government ministers and high-ranking officials.
So a court to hold the powerful accountable.
Yeah. And anyone accused of offenses against the Sultan.
Okay, so he was still above the law in some ways.
Yeah, that's an interesting point.
But overall, it sounds like they were trying to create a more organized and independent judicial system.
Definitely.
So this has been a really fascinating look at the Edict of Reform and the first Ottoman Constitution.
Two really important documents.
Absolutely. They really show how the Ottoman Empire was trying to modernize its legal system.
And they set some really important precedents that would shape Turkish law for years to come.
Absolutely. Okay, well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive for today.
It's been a pleasure.
Thanks so much for joining us. And if you'd like to learn more about Turkish legal history, make sure to subscribe to our channel and give this video a like.
We'll see you in the next lesson.
Bir sonraki derste görüşmek üzere.